Segment 4, America in the World. Again, let me quote the New Road to Serfdom. Throughout the 1990s, the realization gradually dawned on the Europeans that they no longer needed U.S. military protection, close quote. From which, what followed?
Well, the European Union was able to assert itself as a distinct entity which had different and sometimes opposed values to the United States. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. The US doesn't have a monopoly on right any more than any other country does. But if you look at the particular issues on which the European Union has challenged Washington, you see a mindset in Europe that is not particularly conducive to freedom and democracy. I mean, imagine a map of the world. Mm-hmm. Where on that map are the biggest causes of dispute between the US and Europe? I would say that they are Iran, where the European Union is trying to jolly the Ayatollahs out of their nuclear ambitions by being nice to them, constructive engagement. Israel-Palestine, the EU takes very seriously its role as the main funder of the Palestinian state, to the extent that it is having to circumvent its own rules on not financing terrorist organizations so as to keep funneling money to Hamas. China, where the EU has declared in principle its readiness to sell arms to the regime in Beijing, even though it hasn't yet sold any, and where it continues to isolate Taiwan. And I would add, let's say, supranationalism, the International Criminal Court, the landmine treaties, the G20 and Kyoto processes and so on. Now, on all of those, you see an ideological difference between Washington and Brussels. Washington is pushing for democracy rather than stability. The EU is pushing for stability rather than democracy. Both of them, if you like, are being true to their foundational principles. The US was born out of a popular revolt against a remote and autocratic government, and so its sympathy to this day, other things being equal, tends to be with democratization.
Now, Daniel, you want the United States to remain self-confident, to retain the will to project its military power, to continue a central role in Europe, the Middle East, China, and so you want all of that, right? Now, let me suggest to you an American point of view, which involves one part fatigue and one part exasperation. You said a moment ago that the European Union was able to assert itself. And you gave example after example after example where they asserted themselves through talk, but really only through talk. So Milosevic gets out of control in the Balkans, and the Europeans are totally impotent. They simply do not pull themselves together to move in and contain a situation which is on their own continent. Only the armed forces of the United States raining bombs on Serbs brings that situation under control. Or, I give you an example from just a fortnight ago. I'll use the English term for 2 weeks just to make you feel at home here. When we now know that terrorist plans for Mumbai-style attacks were discovered. These attacks were to take place in Britain and France and perhaps elsewhere in Europe. Now then, who rains down predator bombs on Pakistan and Afghanistan to try to disrupt that plot? Who puts their troops in harm's way to try to contain that situation, to address that situation? And who, to this very moment, has not heard from a single European office holder so much as a single merci? So why should Americans continue to bear the burdens and the insults of the Europeans?
Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. I mean, not exclusively a white man's burden now, of course, but don't expect any thanks from those ye guard. That's not how human nature works. Some Europeans have been, almost since the Second World War, driven by this pathological need to bite the hand that freed them.
Can you argue to me from the point of view of American interests why we should continue to put up with these insults?
By the way, I don't think it is in America's interest to maintain costly and ungrateful garrisons all over the world. I think you need to be selective about where you do it.
Okay, hold on. Then let me back up just a little bit farther, because during the 1980s, the late Irving Kristol, are you familiar with his work? Okay. The late Irving Kristol was a kind of, this is even during the Reagan years, he said, you know, NATO is getting a bit out of hand here. That made sense. Our spending a lot of money and having troops in Europe made sense when Europe was still recovering after the Second World War. But these are all rich countries now. We are infantilizing them. We should bring our troops home and let the Europeans defend them, Western Europe, of course, let them defend themselves, because we must not cocoon them from reality, let them encounter reality itself. Was he right about that?
Well, in terms of NATO, I think he was ahead of his time. No one would invent today an organization primarily designed to defend West Germany from a massed assault by Soviet T-72s. And yet, if I look at the world now, where is the biggest deployment of British troops? Massively, the largest overseas garrison is not Iraq or Afghanistan. We have 22,000 soldiers in West Germany.
And we have 50,000.
Right. So
why?
Because no bureaucracy ever volunteers to disband itself.
I'll put the argument to you and then let you address it, let you answer it. The argument runs as follows. The United States is now in about the same position that Britain was in the middle of the last century, right? So China's rising, India's rising. We concede our place as the superpower gracefully or with ill grace, but cede it we must. And do you want to know why that's an appealing argument to the people who have to burden the responsibilities of being the superpower? Because you look at George Bush, who did the best he could, discharging the responsibilities of the United States as an international enforcer of peace and proponent of democracy, and the man is reviled. And the man in Britain who stood up for him, Tony Blair, is covered in spittle at this stage in his career.
Not solely because of that.
No. Well, I mean,
there were loads of reasons for people to be spitting at him.
Yes, but that. Oh, but well, you're British, so I won't argue with you. But as best I can tell, that is certainly the signal reason that he went into Iraq.
That's why he was reviled on the left. There are loads of reasons why he's reviled by conservatives.
Completely different and correct reasons to revile him on the right, but that's a separate program. And now we have Barack Obama looking read that Bob Woodward book. He's trying to find his way here. Yeah. And what he senses is a political reality that if he commits himself to Afghanistan, his own party will be against him. And furthermore, the great mass of the American people are just tired of it all. So why shouldn't the United States look at Britain and say, they actually had pretty good lives once they laid down their empire. They go off to the city, they make a lot of money, they lead quite interesting culture, but it's not a bad life to be number 2 or number 3 instead of number 1. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, I mean, I don't think that it always needs to be the US who goes in. I think you can afford to be a little bit more picky about this. And there is a downside, definitely, to running an expensive foreign policy. There is a downside in terms of expense, and there is a downside in terms of domestic freedom. There is a contradiction in Russell Kirk's phrase between an American republic and an American empire. That said, I'm glad you got the big calls right. I mean, I think the world is a happier place because the United States played its part in defeating fascism and defeating the Soviet tyranny. So it's not an all or nothing. I mean, you can question some of the forward foreign policy positions without being a pacifist, and I think
So you'd at least let me argue for bringing those 50,000 troops in West Germany home.
Oh, I mean, it's crazy for them to be there, yeah. Right. Yeah, no, I mean, by the way, I think that for the US, I want the world is fortunate at the moment in its superpower. We basically, with all the occasional errors that your country makes, as all countries do, I am glad that the preponderant power in the world is a liberal capitalist democracy rather than being Russia or China, right, or the European Union.